In a bustling city hospital, where lives are saved and lost every day, one doctor finds herself at a crossroads between what's right and what's expected. Dr. Amelia Brooks, a dedicated and compassionate surgeon, is faced with a case that will test not only her skills, but her courage to stand against a system that seems designed to fail the most vulnerable. Jamal Harris, a hard-working father of two, is in desperate need of a liver transplant. His condition is critical, and time is slipping away. But when Amelia uncovers that Jamal has been mysteriously pushed to the bottom of the transplant waiting list, she begins to suspect something far more insidious. Wealth and privilege have found a way to rewrite the rules, and now a healthier, wealthier man, a man with deep pockets and powerful connections, has been moved to the front of the line. The conflict that follows pushes Amelia to her limits. She must decide whether to risk her career, her reputation, and even her future to challenge those in power and fight for Jamal's life. As she navigates threats, isolation, and mounting pressure, Amelia begins to uncover the cracks in a system that values influence over fairness, forcing her to ask a question that will define her. How much is one life worth? The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above Dr. Amelia Brooks as she scribbled her last note in the chart. It was past midnight, and the hospital halls were quieter now, save for the occasional murmur of nurses and beeping monitors echoing from nearby rooms. She pulled her stethoscope from around her neck, stretching her back against the creaking office chair. It had been a long shift, but she had learned to live with the exhaustion that clung to her like a heavy coat. Amelia's apartment would be dark and silent by now. There would be no one to greet her except for the distant sound of traffic through the thin windows. It was one of those old complexes that smelled faintly of mildew in the hallways, where paint peeled in quiet defiance. Her small one-bedroom unit was furnished with basic pieces: a second-hand couch, a shelf lined with medical journals, and a lone-framed photo of her late father resting on the kitchen counter. He had been her rock before cancer claimed him, too poor and too late to seek the treatment he had needed. She shook off the memory as her pager went off, the sharp, urgent beep making her stomach tighten. The message was simple. Room 306, liver failure, possible transplant candidate. Amelia grabbed her white coat, her heartbeat quickening. Transplant cases were always time-sensitive, a race against the body's slow collapse. When she entered room 306, her eyes immediately fell on Jamal Harris. He sat propped up in bed, his skin a dull yellow, a sign of his failing liver. Yet there was a calm in his demeanor, an undeniable steadiness despite the wear of sickness. He looked to be in his early 40s, with close-cropped hair flecked with gray at the temples. His hands, calloused and large, gripped the blanket tightly, as if willing himself to stay strong. "Dr. Brooks?" he asked, his voice hoarse but steady. "Yes, Mr. Harris," Amelia replied with a small, reassuring smile as she approached his bedside. She glanced at his vitals, noting the dangerously low blood pressure and elevated bilirubin levels. "I am Dr. Brooks, the attending surgeon tonight. How are you feeling?" "Honestly, I have been better," Jamal said, managing a weak chuckle. "But I am holding on. My kids are counting on me." Amelia looked up, startled. She had not yet seen his family. As if on cue, a small voice piped up, "Daddy, are you okay?" Turning toward the corner of the room, Amelia noticed a boy and a girl huddled together. The boy, Marcus, looked about 10, his dark curls framing an earnest face that tried hard to look brave. Beside him, Samantha, smaller and younger, clutched a teddy bear to her chest. Their clothes were clean, but worn at the elbows and knees, a quiet indicator of their struggles. Amelia's chest tightened. She had seen families like theirs before, people who lived paycheck to paycheck, just one illness away from disaster. "I am fine, baby girl," Jamal said, smiling faintly at his daughter. "You two should go back to Aunt Lisa in the waiting room." "We do not want to leave you," Marcus protested. Amelia knelt in front of the kids, softening her voice. "Your daddy is in good hands, I promise. Why do you not go with your aunt for a bit? I will make sure he gets better." Marcus hesitated but nodded, grabbing Samantha's hand and guiding her reluctantly toward the door. Amelia watched as their small figures disappeared, leaving behind an air of quiet desperation. Turning her focus back to Jamal, Amelia pulled up a chair. "Mr. Harris, I need to be honest with you. Your liver is in critical condition. You need a transplant as soon as possible." "I figured as much," Jamal replied. "It has been bad for months, but I could not take much time off work. Single dad life, you know?" Amelia noted his pride, even in the face of suffering. She asked a few more questions, compiling his medical history and his current state. Jamal answered with calm patience, even when speaking of the nights he had spent in pain, but ignored it so his kids would not see him falter. "Have you been evaluated for the transplant list before?" Amelia finally asked. Jamal nodded. "My primary doctor submitted me a month ago. I think I am on there now, but I have not heard much since." "Okay," Amelia said, jotting notes. "I am going to push your case to the transplant team immediately. You have a strong chance." Jamal looked at her, his expression softening. "Thank you, doctor. I know you have a lot of people to help, but my kids—" He paused, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat. "They already lost their mom. I cannot leave them too." The weight of his words hit Amelia hard, a reminder of why she had become a doctor in the first place. She offered a small, reassuring smile. "We will fight for you, Jamal. I promise." She left his room with his chart in hand, her steps quickening as she headed toward the transplant office. Something about Jamal's case gnawed at her, a sense of urgency that would not let her rest. The next day, Amelia sat in the office of Dr. Mitchell Lawrence, the head of surgery. Papers rustled as she explained Jamal's condition and pushed for his case to be prioritized. "His MELD score puts him near the top of the list," Amelia said, referring to the urgency calculation used for liver transplants. "We need to move on this before it is too late." Dr. Lawrence leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. A seasoned surgeon in his early 60s, he was a man whose opinions carried weight in the hospital. "I hear you, Amelia," he said slowly, his tone measured. "But I also know there is another patient on the list, a Mr. Daniel Kent. He has been a long-term donor to the hospital. His case is complicated." Amelia stiffened. "Daniel Kent's MELD score does not justify priority. Jamal Harris is in far worse condition." Lawrence met her eyes, his voice lowering. "Sometimes these things are not as black and white as they seem." "Excuse me?" Amelia asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "Listen, Amelia, I know you are new here compared to the rest of us, but hospitals do not run on charity alone. Daniel Kent's contributions have helped fund this facility, our equipment, and even part of your department. There are factors at play that you cannot control." Amelia's heart sank. She had known hospitals often catered to donors and influence, but hearing it stated so plainly felt like a punch to the gut. "Jamal Harris has 2 children who are about to lose their father," Amelia said, her voice trembling. "What happens when we start deciding who lives and dies based on how much money they have?" Lawrence sighed, standing up. "Do not make this personal, Amelia. It is out of your hands." But it was personal. Amelia thought of Marcus and Samantha sitting quietly in the waiting room, their small faces etched with worry. She thought of Jamal's soft words. They already lost their mom. Later that evening, Amelia found herself in the staff lounge, staring blankly at a cup of stale coffee. She was tired of the bureaucracy, tired of the invisible forces that dictated who deserved to live and who did not. "Long day?" a voice said softly. Amelia looked up to see Elena, a nurse she often worked with. Elena had kind eyes and a quiet demeanor, someone who did not make waves but always noticed everything. Amelia nodded. One of those days. Elena hesitated before sitting down beside her. I heard about Jamal Harris. He is a good man. And those kids… Amelia glanced at her, surprised. You know them? Elena nodded. I have seen them around the hospital for weeks. They stay close to him, never complaining. I heard their aunt is juggling 2 jobs just to keep things afloat. Something in Elena's voice caught Amelia's attention, an unspoken solidarity, as if Elena understood more than she let on. You care about him too, Amelia said quietly. Elena met her eyes and nodded. I do, and I know how this place works, but sometimes we need to fight for the people who have no voice. I can help you, Dr. Brooks. If you need something, anything, just ask. Amelia blinked, surprised. In that moment, the quiet kindness in Elena's offer pierced through her exhaustion, warming something inside her chest. Thank you, Amelia whispered. For the first time in days, Amelia felt less alone. As she left the hospital that night, her steps were lighter, but the fire inside her burned brighter. Jamal's life was on the line, and she would not back down. The hospital's glow dimmed under the pre-dawn sky as Dr. Amelia Brooks sat alone in her cramped office, her desk strewn with papers and glowing computer monitors. Her coffee sat untouched, its steam long gone, leaving behind a cold bitterness that matched the gnawing unease in her stomach. Jamal Harris's face lingered in her mind, his calm strength, his quiet worry for his children, the way Marcus had tried to be brave for his little sister. Then there was Daniel Kent, the name that now felt like a weight pressing against her chest. Amelia could still hear Dr. Lawrence's words. Sometimes these things are not as black and white as they seem. But to her, they were. The stark numbers on her screen told the truth that no smooth-talking administrator could erase. Jamal's MELD scores, a number designed to measure the severity of liver disease, placed him near the top of the list for urgent need. His liver was failing fast, and without a transplant, time would bleed away from him like water through clenched fists. Daniel Kent, on the other hand, barely met the threshold for eligibility. Amelia skimmed his chart for the 3rd time, her eyes lingering on his vitals and the calculated MELD score. 18. A concerning number, yes, but not urgent. Jamal's score was a staggering 34. Amelia exhaled sharply, her hand brushing over her face. This is not right, she whispered to no one but herself. The door creaked open, breaking her concentration. Elena stepped inside, balancing 2 steaming cups of coffee, her expression soft but watchful. I figured you would still be here, Elena said, placing a cup in front of Amelia. Triple shot, you need it. Amelia managed a faint smile. You are a lifesaver. Elena settled into the chair across from her, her scrubs slightly wrinkled from her shift. She watched Amelia quietly for a moment before speaking. You found something, didn't you? Amelia nodded, tapping the screen with a tired finger. Jamal's urgency score is far higher than Daniel Kent's. Jamal should be at the top of the list, but for some reason, she sighed, shaking her head. His priority has been lowered. I am going to push this to the transplant team today. I will not let him slip through the cracks. Elena's eyes narrowed with quiet determination. You think it is deliberate? I do not know yet, Amelia admitted. But it stinks. Lawrence's comment about Kent being a donor that cannot be a coincidence. Elena leaned forward, her voice lowering. You know they are not going to make this easy for you. Amelia looked at her, exhaustion lining her features. I cannot ignore it, Elena. Those kids, they are going to lose their dad if I do not do something. Elena hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the door before returning to Amelia's. You are not alone in this. If you need evidence, records, anything, I will help you. Amelia blinked, taken aback by the quiet ferocity in Elena's voice. Why are you willing to risk so much? The nurse's gaze softened. Because I have been here too long to pretend this does not happen. I have watched families like Jamal's wait and wait until it is too late, and I cannot forget the faces of the ones who did not make it. Amelia felt a small flicker of relief, like the first crack of sunlight after a long night. She had an ally, and that mattered more than she realized. By mid-morning, Amelia stood outside the conference room where the hospital's transplant committee held their meetings. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, and muffled voices filtered through the heavy door. Amelia's pulse quickened as she reviewed Jamal's chart one last time, mentally preparing her arguments. Stick to the facts. Stay calm. Fight for him. Inside, the transplant team sat around a polished table, cluttered with folders and tablets. At the head of the table sat Dr. Carter Reynolds, the hospital's administrator, a man in his late 50s with slicked-back silver hair and a habit of smiling without warmth. Beside him was Dr. Mitchell Lawrence, his mentor, the lines on his face betraying nothing. "Dr. Brooks," Dr. Reynolds began as Amelia took her seat, "you asked to address the committee today. What is so urgent?" Amelia cleared her throat, placing Jamal's file on the table. "It is about a patient, Jamal Harris. His condition is deteriorating rapidly, according to his MELD score." "We are aware of Mr. Harris's case," Reynolds interrupted, his voice smooth but dismissive. Amelia pressed on. "Then you know his urgency score is 34. He is at immediate risk of liver failure." Dr. Lawrence exchanged a glance with Reynolds before speaking. "We have discussed Jamal's case, Amelia. The list is more complicated than it looks. Other factors—" "What factors?" Amelia shot back, trying to keep her voice steady. "The numbers do not lie. Jamal's case is critical. He should be the first in line for the next available donor." Reynolds's smile tightened. "Dr. Brooks, we take all cases seriously, but there is another candidate, Mr. Daniel Kent, who has also been evaluated." "Daniel Kent's MELD score is 18, Amelia said firmly. "There is no way he should be prioritized over Jamal. Mr. Kent's contributions to this hospital cannot be ignored," Reynolds replied, his tone cool and practiced. "It is not just about numbers. It is about the hospital's future." Amelia stared at him, disbelief washing over her. "So, you are saying that because he is wealthy, his life is worth more?" A heavy silence settled over the room. Dr. Lawrence cleared his throat, his voice softer. "Amelia, you need to be careful with your words." Amelia ignored him, her gaze fixed on Reynolds. "This is wrong, and you know it. Jamal Harris has 2 children who will have no one left if we let him die because someone else has deeper pockets." Reynolds's eyes flashed with something unreadable anger or amusement. Amelia could not tell. "The committee has already made its decision. Thank you for your input, Dr. Brooks. You are dismissed." Amelia's hands trembled as she gathered her papers, her jaw tight with frustration. She had expected resistance, but hearing their decision spoken aloud left her feeling hollow. As she turned to leave, Dr. Lawrence called out softly, "Amelia, a word?" She stopped in the hallway, turning as Lawrence approached, his expression weary. "You are a good doctor," he said quietly, "but you need to know when to back off. This fight, it is not worth your career." Amelia met his gaze, fire burning behind her tired eyes. "It is worth Jamal's life." Dr. Lawrence sighed, his shoulders slumping as he turned back into the conference room. The rest of Amelia's day passed in a blur of routine tasks, chart reviews, quick consults, and rounds through the ICU, but her mind never left Jamal's case. Each time she passed his room, she caught glimpses of Marcus and Samantha, their small figures curled up on waiting room chairs. Their Aunt Lisa sat beside them, exhaustion etched into her face as she balanced phone calls, no doubt trying to hold together the fragile pieces of their lives. That evening, as Amelia pulled on her coat to leave, Elena approached her in the locker room, holding a folded stack of papers. "What is this?" Amelia asked. Internal reports, Elena said softly. I found a pattern. It is not just Jamal. This has happened before. Amelia's heart pounded as she took the papers. Elena, you did not have to. I wanted to, Elena said, cutting her off. You are right, Amelia. This is not just about one patient. It is about all the families who do not get a fair chance. Amelia stared at the papers in her hands, a mixture of relief and dread settling in her chest. This was the proof she needed, proof that the system was rigged, that people like Jamal were being pushed aside to make room for the powerful. As Amelia walked to her car that night, she looked up at the hospital, its bright windows standing tall against the darkening sky. I cannot let this go, she thought. Jamal's life depends on it. She tightened her grip on the folder, knowing the fight ahead would not be easy. But as she thought of Jamal's children waiting, hoping she knew she could not turn back. The following morning, Amelia arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, the sky still painted in soft hues of gray. Sleep had been fleeting. She had spent the night reviewing Elena's reports, her mind spinning with equal parts frustration and determination. The evidence was clear: names, dates, and medical scores, all pointing to a disturbing trend. Patients like Jamal, those with fewer resources and little influence, had been pushed to the bottom of transplant lists. As she parked her car and stepped into the hospital lobby, her nerves buzzed with energy. Today would not be a day for silence. She would bring the truth to the light, no matter the consequences. By mid-morning, Amelia stood outside the hospital boardroom, clutching her folder of evidence like a shield. The board's weekly administrative meeting was underway, and she knew Reynolds, Lawrence, and the rest of the executives would be there. Her stomach churned as she stared at the frosted glass door. The last thing she wanted was a confrontation. But the image of Marcus and Samantha kept flashing in her mind. They deserve better than this. Taking a steadying breath, Amelia knocked and stepped inside. The room was cold and professional, with long mahogany tables, leather chairs, and tall windows that overlooked the city skyline. 8 men and women in crisp suits turned to look at her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and irritation. Reynolds sat at the head of the table, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. Dr. Lawrence was next to him, his face impassive. Dr. Brooks, Reynolds said, his voice smooth but clipped. This meeting is closed to hospital staff. What is it you need? Amelia walked to the head of the table, placing the folder in front of him. I need to address the board about a serious breach of ethical standards concerning the transplant list. A murmur rippled through the room. Reynolds frowned, his smile vanishing. Dr. Brooks, this is highly inappropriate. If you have concerns, you can submit them through the proper... I have already submitted my concerns, Amelia cut in, her voice firm but steady. And they have been ignored. The room fell silent. Amelia opened the folder and pulled out the first report, holding it up for the board to see. These are internal documents showing how transplant urgency scores have been altered. Patients with life-threatening conditions, like Jamal Harris, have been deprioritized without medical justification. Meanwhile, candidates like Daniel Kent, whose condition is far less severe, have been pushed to the top of the list. Reynolds' expression darkened. Dr. Brooks, you are accusing this hospital of serious misconduct. I am presenting evidence, Amelia replied. Jamal Harris's MELD score is a 34. He should be receiving the next available liver. Daniel Kent's score is an 18, and yet he has been fast-tracked because of his financial contributions to this hospital. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Lawrence shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering toward Amelia. Amelia, these decisions are complex. They involve more than just numbers. Then explain it to me, Amelia shot back, her voice rising. Explain to me how a man who has 2 young children depending on him is being ignored while someone else with wealth and influence gets priority. Because to me, it looks like we are choosing money over lives. Reynolds's face turned red, his composure beginning to crack. "You are out of line, Dr. Brooks. The decisions made here are for the good of the hospital." "No," Amelia interrupted sharply. "The good of the hospital is saving lives. That is what we are supposed to do. That is why we took an oath." The room was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation system. For a moment, Amelia thought she had reached one of the board members, perhaps who looked down, avoiding her gaze. But then Reynolds stood, his voice cold and final. "You will stop this now," he said. "You are jeopardizing the hospital's reputation with these accusations. And let me remind you, Dr. Brooks, that insubordination will not be tolerated." Amelia stared at him, her pulse quickening. "You can call it whatever you want, but I am not going to let Jamal Harris die because this hospital values donors over patients. You can suspend me, you can fire me, I do not care. But I will not be silent." Reynolds's eyes narrowed. "Consider this your final warning." Amelia turned on her heel and walked out of the room, the door shutting behind her with a quiet thud. Back in the hallway, Amelia leaned against the cold wall, her breath shaky. She replayed the scene in her mind, her anger still simmering. She had expected resistance, but the sheer indifference in Reynolds' voice left her feeling gutted. "Amelia." She looked up to see Dr. Lawrence approaching her, his face tight with frustration. He grabbed her arm gently, steering her away from the boardroom. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath. "You are going to ruin your career." "Then so be it," Amelia snapped, pulling her arm free. "Jamal Harris's life is worth more than my career." Dr. Lawrence sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You cannot save everyone, Amelia. That is the hardest part of this job. You have to pick your battles." Amelia's expression hardened. "This is my battle. You taught me to do what is right, Mitch. To fight for my patients. So why are you standing here defending them?" Lawrence hesitated, his eyes softening for a brief moment before hardening again. "You do not understand how the system works." "Maybe I do not want to understand it," she shot back. Lawrence looked at her for a long moment, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Be careful," he said quietly before turning and walking away. Amelia watched him go, disappointment settling heavy in her chest. She had once looked up to him, seen him as a mentor. Now, all she saw was a man who had learned to look the other way. That evening, Amelia sat in the small cafeteria, a cup of soup growing cold in front of her. Her mind spun with everything that had happened, the anger and helplessness tangled together like a knot she could not untie. "Dr. Brooks?" She looked up to see Elena standing beside her, a tray in hand. Without waiting for an invitation, the nurse sat down across from her. "You look like you have had a day," Elena said softly. Amelia let out a humorless laugh. "Understatement of the year." Elena studied her for a moment, then leaned forward. "I heard what happened with the board." "Of course you did," Amelia said, shaking her head. "This hospital's rumor mill moves faster than light." Elena smiled faintly, but it quickly faded. "You did the right thing, Amelia. Not everyone has the guts to stand up to them." Amelia stared into her soup. "It feels like it did not make any difference." "It did," Elena said firmly. "You are not the only one who sees what is happening here. People talk. People notice. You are giving them a reason to speak up, too." Amelia looked up, surprised by the quiet conviction in Elena's voice. "Why do you care so much?" Elena hesitated before answering. "Because my brother died waiting for a transplant." Amelia's breath caught. "Elena." "He was like Jamal, hardworking, kind, always putting others first," Elena continued. "But we could not fight the system. I did not know how to back then. But now—" She met Amelia's gaze, her voice steady. "Now I do." Amelia felt something shift inside her, the smallest crack of light breaking through the heaviness. "Thank you," she whispered. "We are in this together," Elena said, offering a small smile. "You are not alone." As Amelia left the cafeteria that night, her steps felt heavier, but her resolve felt stronger. The fight was far from over, and the walls of the system seemed impenetrable. But for the first time in a long time, Amelia realized she was not fighting alone. She thought of Jamal, of Marcus and Samantha, and of Elena's quiet strength. She would not give up, not now, not ever. The hospital halls were quiet, save for the faint echoes of monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes against the linoleum floor. Amelia walked briskly toward the ICU, her mind racing. She had barely slept, and though her body ached for rest, her thoughts kept pulling her back to Jamal Harris. His case felt like an invisible string tied around her heart, tugging her forward, step by step, into an uphill battle. Pausing outside Jamal's room, Amelia drew in a steadying breath. The pale light from the window streamed across his face as he lay still, his chest rising and falling with slow, strained breaths. The soft hum of machines marked time like an unforgiving clock. Marcus and Samantha were nowhere to be seen, but their presence lingered in the room. A paper drawing, one Amelia had not noticed before, hung near Jamal's bed. It was a crude picture of 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a smiling sun. Daddy, Marcus, and Samantha, written carefully in a child's scrawl. Amelia's throat tightened. "Dr. Brooks," a soft voice said from behind her. Amelia turned to find Lisa Harris, Jamal's sister, standing near the door. Lisa looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed and red-rimmed. Her coat was threadbare, and her fingers clutched a tote bag that sagged with the weight of its contents, likely the children's homework, snacks, and clothes. "How is he?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amelia stepped forward. "He is stable for now, but his liver function is deteriorating quickly." Lisa nodded, as if she had already expected the answer. "Is there any news on the transplant?" Amelia hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing against her chest. "I am doing everything I can to make sure Jamal gets the priority he deserves," she said carefully. "We are waiting for a donor, but I will not stop fighting for him." Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Amelia thought she might argue, might demand to know why it was taking so long. But instead, Lisa sank into the chair beside Jamal's bed and looked up at her with surprising softness. "Thank you," Lisa said quietly, "for not giving up on him." Amelia blinked, caught off guard by the quiet gratitude in her voice. "Of course," she managed. Lisa smoothed her hands over her bag, her gaze fixed on her brother. "Jamal has always been the strong one in our family. After my sister-in-law died, I don't know how he managed to keep it all together, but he did. He worked long hours, made sure the kids never went without, even if it meant he did." Amelia listened in silence, her chest tightening with each word. "I wish I could do more," Lisa continued softly, her voice cracking. "But I can barely keep up with the bills as it is. All I can do is bring the kids here and try to keep them from losing hope." "They are lucky to have you," Amelia said gently. Lisa looked up, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "They are lucky to have you too, Dr. Brooks. You are the first doctor who has really fought for him. I know it." The words hit Amelia with surprising force. She had been bracing herself for anger, for questions she could not answer, but instead, she found unexpected kindness. Lisa's quiet strength in the face of such overwhelming circumstances humbled her in a way she could not describe. "I will not let him down," Amelia promised, her voice steady. Lisa nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "You are not alone, you know. We are praying for you too." Later that afternoon, Amelia sat in the hospital cafeteria with Elena, papers spread out between them like puzzle pieces waiting to be solved. The reports Elena had shared the night before sat on the table, highlighted and annotated in red ink. Each document was damning clear evidence that patients with influence, wealth, or connections had repeatedly been prioritized for transplants. Elena tapped one of the highlighted lines. Look here, Daniel Kent's urgency score was adjusted upward by 2 points. 2 points might not seem like much, but it pushed him just high enough to be prioritized over Jamal. Amelia's jaw tightened. There is no medical justification for that adjustment. None. Exactly, Elena replied. I pulled Jamal's records too. His score was lowered last week, right before Daniel's case was reviewed. Lowered? Amelia repeated, incredulous. Who has the authority to change these scores? Elena looked at her meaningfully. The transplant committee, and ultimately, the hospital administration. Amelia felt her pulse quicken, her mind spinning. We need to take this higher to the ethics committee, the state board, someone outside this hospital. Elena nodded, lowering her voice. I can help you gather what you need, but you should know what you are up against. Reynolds has friends in high places. He is not going to let this go without a fight. I do not care, Amelia said firmly. This is about saving lives, not keeping Reynolds comfortable. Elena studied her for a long moment before a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. You are braver than most people I know, Dr. Brooks. Amelia shook her head, her voice softer. I am just doing my job. Elena's smile faded, replaced by a quiet intensity. No, you are doing more than that, and that matters. By evening, Amelia stood outside Jamal's room once again, peering through the glass window. Inside, Marcus and Samantha sat by their father's bedside, their little hands resting on his arms as he slept. Marcus whispered something to his sister, and Samantha nodded, resting her head against his shoulder. The sight made Amelia's throat tighten. Doctor? Amelia turned to see Marcus standing at the door, his dark curls slightly disheveled. His voice was small, but his eyes were steady. Yes, Marcus, Amelia replied gently. Is my dad going to be okay? The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible to answer honestly. Amelia knelt to his level, searching for the right words. Your dad is very strong, she said softly, and I am doing everything I can to help him get better. Marcus studied her for a moment, his expression wise beyond his years. You are a nice doctor. My dad says you care a lot. Amelia smiled faintly, her heart aching. I do care, a lot. Thank you, Marcus said, surprising her with his quiet sincerity. I think you are helping already. Amelia swallowed hard as she watched him disappear back into the room, rejoining his sister. For such a young boy, Marcus carried the weight of hope with a grace that humbled her. That night, Amelia sat at her desk, her office dark except for the pale glow of her computer screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she drafted an anonymous email to the hospital ethics committee. Attached were the documents Elena had helped her gather, proof of manipulated scores, altered records, and a system rigged against those who needed it most. As her mouse hovered over the send button, Amelia hesitated, the weight of what she was about to do settling over her like a heavy blanket. She thought of Reynolds' threats, of Lawrence's warnings, of how quickly her career could crumble under the pressure of it all. But then she thought of Jamal, lying in that bed, fighting with every ounce of strength he had left. She thought of Lisa, holding everything together for her nieces and nephews. She thought of Marcus and Samantha, drawing pictures for their dad and whispering their hopes into the quiet corners of his hospital room. Amelia clicked send. The email disappeared, and for the first time in days, she felt the faintest flicker of relief. It was not over, not by a long shot, but she had taken the first step. As Amelia leaned back in her chair, she whispered to herself, I will not let you down, Jamal. I promise. Outside the window, the city lights glittered like distant stars, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope was still there, waiting to be found. The early morning sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, casting faint lines across Amelia's face as she stood in her office, gripping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She had not slept. After sending the anonymous email to the hospital ethics committee the night before, Amelia's thoughts had been relentless. Every shadow seemed heavier, every sound sharper, as if she were bracing for a storm she could not see, but knew was coming. The knock on her office door startled her. "Come in," Amelia said, her voice tired. Elena slipped inside, closing the door behind her with quiet precision. Her dark eyes searched Amelia's face for answers she had not yet given. "Did you send it?" Elena asked softly. Amelia nodded, her fingers curling tighter around the coffee cup. "I did." Elena exhaled, relief mixed with worry. "Good. Now we wait." Wait. Amelia hated that word. Waiting felt passive, as though she were sitting still while Jamal's time trickled away. She set the cup on her desk with a soft clink. "Elena, what happens if nothing changes? What if no one listens?" "They will," Elena said firmly. "They have to." Amelia wasn't convinced. "Reynolds and Lawrence, they're powerful. I doubt they'll just let this slide. The hospital protects itself first." Elena crossed her arms and leaned against the door. "You did the right thing, Amelia. That has to count for something." Amelia sighed and rubbed her temple. "We'll see." By mid-morning, the atmosphere in the hospital began to shift. Whispers followed Amelia through the halls, soft murmurs from nurses, sideways glances from doctors, the way conversation seemed to hush when she walked past. She knew how rumors worked. The transplant board had likely already begun to circle its wagons. As she entered the ICU for her morning rounds, a familiar voice caught her attention. "Dr. Brooks?" Amelia turned to see Dr. Mitchell Lawrence, standing near the nurses' station. His expression was serious, though his voice carried that familiar, calm tone she had come to associate with him, one he used when trying to diffuse tension. "Dr. Lawrence," she said, carefully keeping her voice neutral. "We need to talk," he said quietly, gesturing toward an empty conference room. The moment Amelia stepped inside, Lawrence closed the door behind them, his hand lingering on the handle for a beat too long before he turned to face her. "What are you doing, Amelia?" he asked, his voice heavy with frustration. Amelia met his gaze evenly. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean." Lawrence folded his arms across his chest. "There are whispers about complaints to the ethics committee, about internal documents being shared. Did you have anything to do with this?" Amelia held her ground. "If I did, would it matter?" Lawrence sighed and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Amelia, you are playing a dangerous game. Do you realize the people you are going up against? Carter Reynolds has the board behind him. If you push too hard, they will ruin your career." "I am not worried about my career," Amelia replied firmly. "I am worried about Jamal Harris." Lawrence's jaw tightened. "I know you care about this man, but you are not going to change how this hospital works. It has been like this for years." "Then it is time it stops," Amelia shot back. "You taught me to fight for my patients. That is all I am doing." "I taught you to pick your battles," Lawrence said softly. "This is not one you can win." Amelia looked at him for a long moment, disappointment settling like a stone in her chest. She had once admired Lawrence, his steady presence, his skill, his calm leadership. But now all she saw was someone who had made his peace with compromise, someone who had stopped asking questions long ago. "I guess we see things differently," she said quietly. Lawrence's expression flickered regret, perhaps, or something close to it. "Be careful, Amelia." As he turned and walked out of the room, Amelia stood alone, her pulse pounding in her ears. For the first time, she felt the true weight of what she had done. She was not naive enough to believe the hospital would let this go without a fight, but she also knew she could not back down. That afternoon, Amelia found herself in Jamal's room once again. His eyes fluttered open when she entered, and he offered her a weak smile. "Dr. Brooks," he said, his voice soft, "you are back." "I am always here," Amelia replied, managing a small smile of her own. She pulled up the chair beside his bed and sat down, studying his face. The jaundice was worse today, the yellow tint deepening in his skin and eyes. His breathing was slower, as though even that simple act required effort. "How are Marcus and Samantha?" Amelia asked. Jamal's smile grew faintly. "They are tough kids. Lisa took them out for a walk. I think she is trying to keep them busy." "They are good kids," Amelia said softly. "They care about you a lot." Jamal's eyes flickered with something distant, grief, maybe, or worry. "They are my whole world," he said. "I just want to see them grow up, you know. I want to teach Marcus how to fix cars. Samantha loves to sing. I want to hear her sing at her school recital one day. He paused, his voice cracking. "I just need more time." Amelia swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "We are fighting for that time, Jamal, I promise." He looked at her then, his expression serious despite his exhaustion. "I believe you, doctor. I know you care. Not all doctors care like you do." Amelia felt her chest tighten. "You deserve a fair chance, Jamal. That is all I want for you." Jamal nodded faintly, his eyes drifting closed again. Amelia sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors, the soft hiss of the oxygen machine. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. When Amelia stepped into the hallway, Elena was waiting for her. "Amelia," Elena said, her voice low, "you need to see this." She handed Amelia a tablet with an email open on the screen. It was from the Ethics Committee, a formal notice that they had received the complaint and would be launching an investigation. Amelia's breath caught. "They responded," Amelia whispered. Elena nodded. "This is big. If they dig into what we found, Reynolds and the board are going to have a lot to answer for." Amelia felt a rush of relief, tempered quickly by the reality of what this meant. "We need to be ready. Reynolds is not going to take this quietly." Elena smiled faintly. "Neither are we." As the day dragged into evening, Amelia found herself walking back to her office, exhausted but hopeful. She was about to open her door when she heard voices, angry voices, coming from the hallway nearby. "Who do you think you are?" It was Carter Reynolds. Amelia froze, her body tensing. "I do not know what you are talking about," another voice replied. It was Elena. "You have been digging where you should not," Reynolds said, his voice icy. "I suggest you stop before you make a mistake you will regret." There was a pause, and then Elena replied, her voice clear and steady. "I am just doing my job." Reynolds's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he walked away, leaving silence in his wake. Amelia turned the corner to see Elena standing near the nurse's station, her face pale but resolute. "Are you okay?" Amelia asked softly, approaching her. Elena let out a shaky breath and nodded. "I am fine. He is just trying to intimidate me." Amelia felt anger surge in her chest. "He cannot do this. He cannot threaten you." Elena met her gaze and smiled faintly. "I told you, Amelia. We are in this together." Amelia felt something shift inside her. Elena's courage, Jamal's quiet strength, the unwavering faith of Marcus and Samantha, it was all connected. Each of them was fighting in their own way, refusing to give up, even when the odds seemed impossible, and neither would she. As Amelia turned toward her office, her shoulders straightened, the fire in her chest burning brighter than ever. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The soft hum of Amelia's computer filled her dimly lit office as she sat at her desk, staring at the Ethics Committee's formal acknowledgement of her complaint. The sterile wording seemed so impersonal for the life-or-death situation at hand. A hollow acknowledgement in black and white, promising a thorough investigation, but offering no timeline, no urgency. Amelia drummed her fingers on the desk, her mind racing. An investigation would take time, weeks, maybe months, time that Jamal didn't have. The knot in her stomach grew tighter. The truth was out there now, but the system moved at its own glacial pace. And Jamal, his liver was failing fast. A knock on her door startled her from her thoughts. Elena slipped in, her eyes darting around as if checking for prying ears. Her face was tight with worry. "I just checked Jamal's chart," Elena said softly. "His numbers are worse today. The jaundice, the ascites, it's all progressing. He doesn't have much time, Amelia." Amelia clenched her fists. "I know, and this investigation isn't going to save him in time." Elena nodded slowly. "Then what do we do?" Amelia looked at her, a flicker of determination returning to her exhausted face. "We keep fighting." Later that morning, Amelia slipped into the hospital records department, a quiet, windowless room tucked away in the basement. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and computer terminals blinked on the desks, their screens reflecting a cold blue glow. It was a place most doctors rarely visited, but Amelia had no choice. If she was going to find out who was manipulating the transplant scores, she needed more evidence. Elena had agreed to cover for her upstairs, claiming Amelia was consulting on a complex case. It wasn't a lie, Amelia thought grimly. Jamal Harris's case was complex, but not in the way it should have been. Sitting down at one of the computers, Amelia logged into the transplant database. Her access was limited, but she knew how to navigate it well enough to find what she needed. She started with Jamal's file. The urgency scores still sat at a 34, but her heart sank when she noticed a small, time-stamped note buried deep in the system. Adjustment, priority status review, pending Dr. Carter Reynolds. Amelia stared at the screen, anger bubbling up inside her. Reynolds. He had been directly involved in reviewing Jamal's score, likely the same day Daniel Kent's case had been re-evaluated. She pulled up Daniel's file next and felt her hands go cold. Daniel's score had been adjusted upward on the same day Jamal's status was placed under review. The justification cited vague terms, overall health concerns, and long-term hospital benefit, but no real data. It was a cover, plain and simple. Amelia grabbed a notepad from the desk and scribbled the details down, her pulse quickening. "Dr. Brooks." The deep voice from behind her sent a jolt through her chest. She turned sharply to see Dr. Reynolds standing in the doorway. His silver hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his face cold and unreadable. "What are you doing down here?" he asked, his voice calm but with a dangerous edge. Amelia straightened, her heart pounding. "I'm checking on a patient's records." Reynolds stepped closer, his shoes clicking against the tile floor. "You're not supposed to be in this department without authorization." "Authorization?" Amelia countered, forcing her voice to stay even. "I'm a doctor. I have every right to access my patient's records." Reynolds's expression hardened, the thin veneer of politeness cracking. "You are overstepping, Dr. Brooks. First, you disrupt our transplant board, and now you're digging through records that are none of your concern." "None of my concern?" Amelia shot back, her anger finally breaking through. "A man is dying, Dr. Reynolds. A man who should be first in line for a transplant, but isn't because of decisions you and the board made." Reynolds's mouth curled into a faint, condescending smile. "You are treading on dangerous ground, Amelia. You are young, talented, full of potential. But if you continue down this path, you'll throw it all away." Amelia stepped forward, her voice steady. "I don't care about my career if it means letting a good man die so that someone with money and connections can take his place." Reynolds's eyes narrowed, his tone turning icy. "Then you're making a mistake you'll regret." Before Amelia could respond, Reynolds turned sharply and strode out of the room, his footsteps echoing through the hallway. She exhaled shakily, her heart still pounding in her ears. Reynolds had threatened her not overtly, but enough to send a chill through her bones. He knew. And now he was warning her to back down. But she couldn't. Gathering the papers, she had scribbled on. Amelia left the records room, her determination unshaken. That evening, as Amelia made her way to the ICU, she spotted Lisa Harris sitting in the hallway outside Jamal's room. The small bench creaked beneath her as she leaned forward, holding her phone in her hands but staring blankly at the floor. "Lisa?" Amelia said softly, approaching her. Lisa looked up, her face weary. "Hi, Dr. Brooks. Is everything okay?" Lisa shook her head, pressing her lips together as if holding back tears. "I had to tell the kids they couldn't come tonight. Marcus wanted to stay, but Samantha's been falling behind in school. I couldn't keep them here another night. They need something normal." Amelia sat beside her, the bench cold beneath her. "You're doing everything you can." Lisa's voice cracked. "Is it enough? I feel like I'm failing him. Failing them." Amelia reached out and touched her shoulder gently. "You're not failing anyone. You're holding everything together when it feels impossible. That's more than enough." Lisa looked at her, tears pooling in her eyes. "What if it doesn't matter? What if Jamal doesn't get the transplant in time?" Amelia's chest tightened. She couldn't offer false hope, not when the situation was so dire, but she also couldn't let Lisa lose faith. "We're fighting for him, Lisa. I promise you. I will do everything I can." Lisa nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for caring. He always says you're the one who gives him hope." As night fell, Amelia sat at her desk once more, staring at the stack of papers she had gathered. The evidence was growing, but so was the pressure. Reynolds was watching her now, and she could feel the walls closing in. A sharp knock on her door made her jump. "Dr. Brooks?" She looked up to see Dr. Noah Reed, a surgeon from another department. Noah was a quiet man with sharp blue eyes and a reputation for being honest to a fault. He stepped inside and closed the door, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Reed," Amelia said, surprised. "What can I do for you?" Noah hesitated, glancing at the papers scattered on her desk. "Word has it you're going up against the administration." Amelia stiffened. "And what if I am?" Noah smiled faintly, a glimmer of something like respect in his eyes. "I just wanted you to know, not everyone in this hospital agrees with them. If you need someone to back you up, I'm here." Amelia blinked, caught off guard. "You'd risk that?" He shrugged. "I took the same oath you did, Amelia. Maybe it's time we all started remembering why we're here." For the first time in days, Amelia felt something shift, a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone. Elena, Noah, Lisa. They were all pieces of this growing fight, quiet sparks of courage in a system built to silence them. As Noah left, Amelia leaned back in her chair, her resolve hardening. The fight was far from over, but now it felt less like a losing battle, and in her heart, she knew Jamal Harris still had a chance. The air in the ICU felt heavier than usual as Amelia hurried down the hallway, her shoes tapping rhythmically against the polished linoleum. The faint smell of antiseptic mingled with the quiet beeps of monitors, sounds Amelia had grown numb to over the years. Today, though, they felt sharper each sound, punctuating the urgency pressing on her chest. She rounded the corner to Jamal Harris's room and stopped just outside the glass. Inside, Jamal's body looked even smaller against the sterile white sheets. His skin, now an even deeper shade of yellow, seemed almost translucent in the pale hospital light. Lisa sat in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around her frame, as though she were trying to hold herself together. Amelia could see her quietly whispering prayers under her breath. Jamal stirred, his eyes fluttering open with a sluggish effort. The small movement was enough to bring Lisa to his side. Amelia's chest tightened. She had seen it before the tipping point. Patients with failing livers would seem to drift out of reach, their bodies slowly giving up as toxins built in their bloodstream. Jamal was slipping. There is no more time, she thought. An hour later, Amelia burst through the doors of the transplant board's office, her white coat flaring behind her like a banner. The room was empty, save for Dr. Carter Reynolds, who sat behind his massive mahogany desk. He barely looked up from his computer screen when she entered. "Dr. Brooks," he said without emotion, "I don't recall having you on my schedule today." "We need to talk about Jamal Harris," Amelia said, her voice steady but sharp. Reynolds's eyes flickered toward her, his expression unreadable. "We've already discussed this, Amelia. I suggest you let it go." "I can't do that," she replied, stepping closer to his desk. "Jamal doesn't have days left. His condition is worsening by the hour. He needs that transplant." Reynolds sighed, sitting back in his chair as if tired of repeating himself. "You don't understand how these decisions work. It's not as simple as you want it to be." Amelia's frustration boiled over. "It is that simple. You manipulated the system to prioritize Daniel Kent. You took a man who could wait and pushed him ahead of someone who can't. You're killing Jamal Harris, and you know it." Reynolds's face darkened. "Careful, Dr. Brooks." Amelia slammed a file down onto his desk. It was the compilation of evidence she had been gathering for days, Jamal's records, the internal notes, the adjusted scores. "I'm not being careful. I'm telling you what I know. I sent this to the ethics committee, and they're investigating. But Jamal doesn't have time to wait for an investigation. We need to act now." Reynolds' thin smile returned, a predator sensing weakness. "And what do you hope to accomplish here? You think you can fight the system? You think you can save everyone, Dr. Brooks?" "That's naive." Amelia stared at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. "I don't need to save everyone. I need to save him." Reynolds held her gaze for a long moment before standing. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "You need to understand something, Amelia. You're walking a fine line. If you continue down this path, you'll lose everything: your job, your license, your reputation. Is Jamal Harris worth that to you?" Amelia didn't flinch. "Yes," she said quietly, "he is." Reynolds straightened, his smile vanishing. "You'll regret this." Amelia turned and walked out without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. She knew what was coming: retaliation, threats, maybe worse, but she couldn't stop now. By the time Amelia reached her office, her heart was still racing. She sank into her chair, head in her hands, trying to gather her thoughts. A knock at the door made her look up. It was Dr. Noah Reed, his face lined with concern. "Hey," he said, stepping inside. "I heard you went after Reynolds." Amelia leaned back in her chair, her exhaustion catching up to her. "I didn't have a choice." Noah shut the door behind him and sat in the chair across from her. "I've seen guys like Reynolds before. They're all the same, protecting power at any cost." He hesitated. "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know," Amelia admitted. "The ethics committee is looking into it, but it'll take time. Jamal doesn't have time." Noah was quiet for a moment before he spoke again, his voice soft but firm. "You're not alone, Amelia. You've got me, Elena, and the nurses. We're with you." Amelia felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you, Noah. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." "You're doing what's right," he said simply. "That's enough." As the day wore on, Amelia's nerves frayed further. By evening, Jamal's condition had worsened again. His vitals were shaky, his breathing more labored. Lisa paced the room while Marcus and Samantha sat on either side of their father's bed, their little hands holding his. "Daddy?" Samantha's voice was small, barely audible. Jamal's eyes fluttered open, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "I'm here, baby girl," he whispered. Amelia stood at the foot of the bed, helpless in the face of their quiet despair. She had never felt this powerless before. Jamal was running out of time, and the system that was supposed to save him was instead abandoning him. "Doctor?" Marcus's voice broke through her thoughts. You're going to fix my dad, right? Amelia looked at him, the earnest hope in his eyes nearly undoing her. She knelt beside him, keeping her voice steady. I'm trying, Marcus. I promise you, I'm trying. Marcus nodded and squeezed his father's hand. Amelia watched him for a moment, her resolve hardening again. This can't be the end. That night, Amelia sat in her office, staring at her computer screen. Noah's words echoed in her mind. You're not alone. She thought about Elena sneaking her reports, about Noah standing by her, and about Lisa, Marcus, and Samantha, who still held on to hope despite everything. Her gaze flickered to the phone on her desk. There was one more move she could make, one last push to get Jamal what he deserved. It was risky, but she had already crossed the point of no return. She dialed a number she had memorized from the hospital's contacts list and waited. This is Dr. Amelia Brooks, she said when the line connected. I need to speak with the state transplant registry. It's urgent. The person on the other end hesitated. Is this about a patient? Yes, Amelia replied firmly. A patient whose case is being mishandled. By morning, Amelia was back in the ICU, exhaustion pressing behind her eyes. She had spent hours on the phone with the transplant registry, outlining every inconsistency she had uncovered, every injustice Jamal had faced. She didn't know if it would be enough, but at least someone outside of Reynolds's grasp was now listening. Lisa greeted her with a faint smile when she entered Jamal's room. Morning, doctor. How is he? Amelia asked, moving to check Jamal's vitals. He had a rough night, Lisa admitted, but he's hanging on. He always hangs on. Amelia nodded, her hand resting lightly on Jamal's arm. Keep holding on, she whispered. As Amelia turned to leave, her pager went off, the sharp beeping making her heart leap into her throat. She glanced down at the message and froze. Match found donor available. Priority patient. Jamal Harris. Amelia's hand trembled as she read the words again, hardly able to believe them. She turned to Lisa, her voice breaking with emotion. They found a donor. Lisa gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh my God! Tears welled in her eyes as she stumbled toward Jamal's bed, gripping his hand tightly. They found one, Jamal. They found one. Amelia's heart raced as she rushed out of the room to prepare for surgery. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the tide had turned. Hold on, Jamal, she thought. We're not done fighting for you yet. Amelia moved through the halls of the hospital with urgency, her pager still clutched tightly in her hand. The words, match found donor available. Priority patient, Jamal Harris, echoed in her head like a heartbeat. It was as if time had cracked open, and she was racing to grab hold of the moment before it disappeared. She burst into the surgical prep area, her chest heaving with the effort to contain her nerves. Nurses were already moving quickly, pulling instruments, readying the operating room. In the middle of it all stood Dr. Noah Reed, scrub cap already in place. He looked up as she entered, his sharp blue eyes filled with determination. I saw the page, he said, meeting her halfway. Is it true? Jamal got the donor liver? Amelia nodded, barely able to suppress the tremor of relief in her voice. It's true? He's being prepped now. We're going to do this. Noah's expression softened just slightly. This is because of you, Amelia. No, she replied, shaking her head. It's because Jamal held on. Because people like you and Elena stood with me. He didn't argue. Instead, Noah grabbed a pair of gloves and began pulling them on. Let's get ready. Jamal needs us at our best. As Jamal was wheeled into the operating room, Amelia felt a surge of quiet focus settle over her. This was where she belonged in the sterile calm of surgery, where skill and precision could mean the difference between life and death. Jamal's face was peaceful beneath the oxygen mask, though his body looked frail, worn down by months of illness. Jamal, she said softly, leaning close before the anesthesia took hold. We've got you. You're going to see your kids again." His eyes fluttered open just a crack, and though he couldn't speak, he looked at her with gratitude that spoke louder than words. Amelia stepped back as the anesthesiologist gave her a nod. "He's ready. Let's begin," she said, her voice steady. The hours that followed were a blur of movement, sweat, and unrelenting focus. Amelia stood at the operating table alongside Noah, her hands steady as they worked in tandem. The donor liver, healthy and vibrant, lay waiting. All they had to do now was make sure Jamal's body accepted it. "Vitals are stable," a nurse called, her voice calm but clipped. "Good," Amelia replied, her eyes never leaving the surgical field. "We'll start the anastomosis. Noah, get ready for the first suture." "Yes, ma'am," he said with a faint smile behind his mask, his tone light despite the gravity of the moment. Amelia's hands worked methodically, guided by years of training and instinct. There was no room for doubt here, no room for anything except the steady rhythm of the surgery. Each stitch brought her closer to saving Jamal's life. "BP dropping slightly," the anesthesiologist warned. Amelia glanced at the monitor, her heart clenching. "Noah, let's move faster. Clamp there, good. Nurse, prepare another round of fluids." "BP stabilizing," came the next call. Amelia exhaled slowly. "Hold on, Jamal." Time stretched endlessly, but Amelia barely felt it. When they finally secured the liver in place, she looked up at the clock. 6 hours. 6 hours that felt like seconds and years all at once. "Dr. Brooks," Noah said quietly, looking at the monitors, "the new liver is perfusing perfectly. Vitals are strong." Amelia looked down at Jamal, the faint rise and fall of his chest more reassuring than any words could be. Relief flooded through her, but she couldn't celebrate not yet. "Let's close," she said softly. It was well past midnight when Amelia finally removed her gloves and scrubbed out. The exhaustion hit her like a wave, but the relief kept her upright. Noah joined her a moment later, his scrubs stained, and his expression weary but satisfied. "That was a beautiful surgery," he said. Amelia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's going to make it." Noah grinned faintly. "He's got a fighting chance now, thanks to you." Amelia didn't go home that night. Instead, she sat outside the recovery room, her body slumped in a chair as she watched Jamal through the glass. He was still sedated, but his breathing was steady. Footsteps broke her quiet vigil, and she looked up to see Lisa Harris rushing toward her, Marcus and Samantha trailing closely behind. Lisa's eyes were wide, her face full of cautious hope. "Dr. Brooks?" Amelia stood, her body aching from the long surgery, but her smile came naturally. "He made it, Lisa. The transplant was a success." Lisa's hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, God, thank you, thank you." Amelia turned to the children, who were looking up at her with wide, sleepy eyes. Marcus spoke first. "You fixed him?" Amelia knelt down so she was level with him. "We did everything we could, Marcus. Your dad is strong. He's going to get better." For the first time, Marcus let a smile break across his face. He turned to Samantha, who clutched her teddy bear tightly. "Daddy's going to be okay, Sam." Lisa pulled Amelia into a hug, her voice trembling. "You saved his life, Dr. Brooks. You saved our family." Amelia swallowed hard, her chest tight with emotion. He did the hard part. He held on. The quiet of the moment didn't last long. Just as Amelia sat back down, ready to let the relief wash over her, a voice broke through the hallway. "Dr. Brooks!" She turned to see Dr. Reynolds, his face pale with fury as he marched toward her. Behind him trailed 2 members of the hospital board, their expressions unreadable. "Come with me," Reynolds said, his voice low and sharp. Amelia glanced back at Jamal's recovery room, where Lisa and the kids were still pressed close to the glass, oblivious to the storm brewing behind them. With a final deep breath, she stood and followed Reynolds down the hallway. The boardroom was silent, a stark contrast to the emotional whirlwind Amelia had just left. She stood in the center of the room, facing the board members seated like judges behind the long table. Carter Reynolds leaned forward, his voice cold and calculated. "We know you went to the state transplant registry, Dr. Brooks. We know you interfered with hospital procedures." Amelia's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice calm. "I did what was right. Jamal Harris's life was at risk, and the system was failing him." "Your actions were reckless," Reynolds snapped. "You've damaged this hospital's reputation and violated protocol." "I saved a man's life," Amelia shot back. The room fell silent. One of the board members, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, finally spoke. "We will conduct a formal review of your actions, Dr. Brooks. In the meantime, you are suspended indefinitely." Amelia swallowed, the words hitting her like a punch to the gut. Reynolds smiled faintly, his victory clear. "You've made your choices, Dr. Brooks. Now you'll live with them." Amelia didn't respond. She turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps steady despite the ache in her chest. Outside, Amelia leaned against the wall, letting the weight of the suspension sink in. Her career might be in free fall, but somewhere behind her, Jamal Harris was alive. Marcus and Samantha would wake up tomorrow, knowing their father was still with them. That was enough. And as the sun began to rise, streaking faint gold across the hospital's towering windows, Amelia knew one thing for certain. She had done what was right, no matter the cost. The morning sun painted soft streaks of gold across the sky as Amelia stood outside the hospital, her white coat draped over one arm and her badge tucked into her pocket. The air was crisp, and every breath she took felt heavier, as though the weight of everything she had fought for still clung to her chest. Her suspension was official now. She was barred from the hospital, her access revoked, her name whispered through the halls like a cautionary tale. The email had been clinical, and to the point, effective immediately. Dr. Amelia Brooks is placed on indefinite leave pending formal review. It wasn't unexpected, but reading those words still stung like salt in an open wound. Her career, her life's work, had been taken from her for doing the very thing she had sworn to do: save lives. Amelia turned back to look at the hospital one last time. She could see nurses and doctors moving through the halls, their figures distorted through the glass, distant and untouchable. Somewhere in there, Jamal Harris lay in recovery, alive, healing. The knowledge brought her a flicker of relief, like a lone ember in a dying fire. "They can take everything from me," she thought. But they can't take that. Amelia spent the next few days at home, pacing the narrow living room of her small apartment as her mind spun restlessly. The quiet felt oppressive after years of the constant hum of hospital life. She had built her world around work, filling every hour with surgeries, rounds, and late nights at her desk. Without it, the silence pressed in on her like a weight she couldn't shake. The phone calls started on the second day. Some came from friends, doctors she had trained with, nurses she had worked alongside, people who were reaching out to check on her with cautious words and sympathetic tones. Others were less kind. "You're making waves, Amelia," one colleague said in a hushed voice. "This isn't how things are done. You know that." "This isn't how things are done." The words replayed over and over in her mind. Was that really what it all came down to? A system so broken that speaking up, that doing the right thing, was seen as betrayal. On the third day, her phone rang again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something made her pick up. "Hello? Dr. Brooks?" a woman's voice said on the other end. "This is Lisa Harris." Amelia's heart leapt at the sound of her name. Lisa. "How's Jamal? How are the kids?" "He's awake," Lisa said, and Amelia could hear the emotion in her voice. Relief exhaustion, hope. He's still weak, but the doctors say he's doing well. They think he'll make a full recovery. Amelia closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. He's awake. A weight she hadn't realized she was carrying lifted from her shoulders, and for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe. "That's incredible," she said softly. "Marcus and Samantha were with him yesterday," Lisa continued. "You should have seen their faces. They haven't stopped smiling." Amelia swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I'm so glad, Lisa. I've been thinking about all of you." Lisa hesitated. "I've been thinking about you too, Doctor. I heard about what happened with your job." "It's fine," Amelia said quickly, forcing her voice to stay light. "I knew the risks." "Well, I don't think it's fine," Lisa replied firmly. "You saved my brother's life. That should matter more than anything else." "It does matter," Amelia said. "Jamal's alive. That's what counts." There was a pause on the line before Lisa spoke again, quieter this time. "Marcus keeps asking about you. He wants to know when you're coming back to the hospital." Amelia smiled faintly, though it felt bittersweet. "Tell him I'll visit as soon as I can." "You're a good person, Dr. Brooks," Lisa said. "Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." "Thank you, Lisa," Amelia whispered, the words catching in her throat. When the call ended, Amelia sat on the edge of her couch, staring at the phone in her hand. Jamal was awake. He was alive. And though she couldn't be there to see it, Amelia knew that Marcus and Samantha were sitting by their father's bedside, holding his hands and smiling through their tears. "That's why I did it," she thought. "No matter what happens to me, it was worth it." A week passed before Amelia received another call, this time from Dr. Noah Reed. "Are you free for lunch?" he asked, his tone uncharacteristically upbeat. Amelia frowned, surprised. "Lunch?" "Yes," he said. "You've been holed up in that apartment long enough. Meet me at the cafe by the hospital." Amelia hesitated, her mind flashing back to the hospital and all it represented: her career, her mistakes, her loss. "Noah, I don't know if—" "No excuses, Amelia," he interrupted. "Be there in an hour." Amelia sighed, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite herself. "Fine." The cafe was a small, unassuming place just a block from the hospital. Amelia hadn't been back here since her suspension, and the sight of it brought back a strange mix of memories: late-night coffees, hurried lunches between surgeries, conversations with colleagues that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. She spotted Noah immediately, sitting by the window with 2 cups of coffee and a small paper bag on the table. He waved her over, a grin on his face. "You look awful," he said, as she sat down. Amelia snorted, rolling her eyes. "Thanks, Noah. You're a real charmer." He pushed one of the cups toward her. "Black coffee, 2 sugars, just how you like it." "Appreciate it," she replied, taking a sip. The warmth spread through her, grounding her a little. Noah leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she said automatically. Noah raised an eyebrow. "Liar." Amelia sighed, staring into her coffee. "I don't know, Noah. I keep telling myself I did the right thing, but sometimes I wonder if it'll even matter in the end. Jamal's alive, but the system is still broken." "It matters," Noah said firmly. "More than you know." Amelia looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He reached into the paper bag on the table and pulled out a folded newspaper. "Here, page 2. Amelia took the paper, her heart skipping a beat as her eyes landed on the headline, "Whistleblower Doctor Exposes Transplant Injustice. Hospital Faces Scrutiny Over Manipulated Waiting List." Her mouth went dry as she scanned the article. It detailed everything: the manipulated MELD scores, the prioritization of wealth over need, the Ethics Committee's investigation now underway, and then, at the very end, it mentioned her by name. Dr. Amelia Brooks, the surgeon who brought these concerns to light, has been suspended pending review. Amelia looked up at Noah, speechless. This story's everywhere now, Noah said. People are asking questions. The board can't sweep this under the rug anymore. Amelia's hands trembled slightly as she set the paper down. How did they get all of this? Noah shrugged. The ethics committee must have leaked it, or maybe someone on the inside wanted the truth to get out. Amelia sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. She had been prepared to lose everything for Jamal, but now it felt like the tide was turning, like maybe, just maybe, change was finally happening. You did this, Amelia, Noah said quietly. You stood up when no one else would. And because of you, people are paying attention. Amelia swallowed hard, her throat tight. For so long, the fight had felt like a losing battle, but now she could see the cracks forming in the walls she had been up against. Thank you, Noah, she said softly. He grinned, lifting his coffee cup in salute. To doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Amelia smiled faintly, lifting her cup as well. To Jamal. To Jamal, Noah echoed. As Amelia sat there, sunlight spilling through the window, she felt a flicker of hope she hadn't dared to feel in weeks. The fight wasn't over, but maybe for the first time, she wasn't fighting it alone. The hospital looked different in the early morning light. It was the same building, the same glass windows gleaming in the sunlight, but for Amelia Brooks, it felt as though the walls had softened. She stood in the parking lot, the brisk air biting her cheeks, and took a deep breath. It was the first time she'd set foot here since her suspension. The news stories had spread like wildfire. Headlines exposing the corruption in the hospital's transplant process had forced the administration into a corner. Carter Reynolds' name was now being mentioned alongside words like investigation, misconduct, and resignation. The ethics committee had found enough evidence to force sweeping changes. The system that had failed so many was being scrutinized at every level, and Amelia knew the fight had only just begun, but it was a start. And today, she was back. Amelia tightened her grip on her bag and stepped through the sliding doors. She expected stares, whispers, maybe even hostility, but what greeted her instead surprised her. Nurses at the station looked up and smiled faintly, nodding their heads as though sharing a quiet understanding. A few doctors acknowledged her with curt nods of respect. The whispers she had feared were now murmurs of admiration. Dr. Brooks? She turned to see Dr. Noah Reed walking toward her, his usual steady grin lighting up his face. Look at you, he teased, walking back in like a hero. I'm no hero, Amelia said, with a tired smile. I just couldn't let it go. Yeah, well, sometimes that's what makes the difference. He gave her a once-over. Ready to get back to work? More than ready, Amelia replied. Noah stepped aside, gesturing dramatically toward the ICU hallway. After you, Brooks. Amelia shook her head with a quiet laugh, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. Jamal Harris's room was on the far side of the ICU, where sunlight spilled in through tall windows and softened the harsh lines of the machines. Amelia stopped just outside the door, letting herself take it in. Jamal was sitting up in bed, his skin no longer tinged with yellow. He looked thinner, weaker, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Marcus and Samantha sat on either side of him, clutching his arms as though afraid to let go. Lisa stood nearby, one hand resting on Jamal's shoulder. When Jamal noticed her, his face broke into a smile. Dr. Brooks, he said, his voice stronger than she had expected. You came. Amelia stepped inside, her chest tightening with emotion. Of course I did. Samantha clutched her teddy bear tightly and looked up at Amelia. Daddy's better now because of you. Amelia knelt down so she was eye level with the little girl. Your daddy's better because he's the strongest man I know, and because of how much you and Marcus love him. Marcus's face lit up with pride. We told him he had to get better. We wouldn't let him give up. Amelia stood and moved closer to Jamal, who extended a hand. She took it, his grip firmer than she expected. "I don't know how to thank you," Jamal said softly. "You gave me my life back. You gave my kids their dad." Amelia swallowed hard, her voice catching. "You fought for your life, Jamal." "I just helped where I could." Jamal shook his head slowly. "You did more than that. You cared when no one else did. That matters." Lisa stepped forward, her eyes shining. "Marcus keeps calling you a superhero. I think he's right." Amelia smiled faintly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "No superheroes here, just people trying to do the right thing." Jamal leaned back against the pillows, his expression peaceful. "Well, you did it. Thank you for not giving up." Amelia squeezed his hand gently before letting go. "Keep getting stronger, Jamal. Your kids need you." "They've got me," Jamal replied. "Thanks to you." As Amelia walked back through the hospital, she felt lighter, as though she had shed a weight she'd been carrying for weeks. She passed the nurse's station, where Elena caught her eye. "Hey," Elena called softly, stepping over. "I saw you in Jamal's room." "He looks good," Amelia said, a smile tugging at her lips. Elena nodded, her expression soft. "He's alive because of you. You did what nobody else would." Amelia looked at her, humbled. "You helped me get there. You didn't have to, but you did." Elena shrugged, though her eyes glistened with emotion. "Some fights are worth it." Amelia nodded. "Yeah, they are." Elena hesitated, then added, "By the way, word is Reynolds submitted his resignation this morning. The board's trying to clean house." Amelia blinked, surprised. "He resigned?" "Yep. Looks like the pressure finally broke him," Elena said, her voice tinged with satisfaction. "Guess even the untouchable ones fall eventually." Amelia exhaled slowly, absorbing the news. It didn't feel like a victory, not yet, but it was a step. "Things will change, Amelia," Elena added quietly. "Maybe not overnight, but they'll change." Amelia smiled faintly, hope flickering in her chest. "I think you're right." That evening, Amelia found herself sitting on a park bench not far from the hospital. The air was cool, and the faint sounds of children playing echoed through the trees. She watched as a familiar figure made its way across the grass. Jamal Harris walked slowly, his steps careful but steady. Marcus and Samantha ran ahead of him, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Lisa followed a few paces behind, keeping a watchful eye on her brother as he made his way to the bench beside Amelia. "Fancy seeing you here, Dr. Brooks," Jamal said, sinking onto the bench with a grunt. "I like this park," Amelia replied with a smile. "It's peaceful." Jamal looked out at his kids, his eyes soft. "They haven't stopped smiling since I came home. It's been a long time since I've seen them this happy." "You deserve this," Amelia said quietly. Jamal turned to look at her. "You know, I spent a long time thinking no one would fight for a man like me. I was wrong. You proved that." Amelia shook her head. "You proved that you were worth fighting for." Jamal smiled faintly. "You've got a good heart, Doctor. Don't let this world take that from you." Amelia looked at him for a moment before responding, her voice soft. "I won't." Across the park, Marcus waved toward them, calling out, "Dad, come play." Jamal chuckled, pushing himself to his feet. "Duty calls." He took a few steps before pausing. Turning back, he looked at Amelia with a mix of gratitude and warmth. "You're part of our family now, Dr. Brooks. Don't forget that." Amelia smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. "I won't forget." As Jamal walked toward his children, Amelia sat back on the bench, watching as Marcus and Samantha tackled their father in a fit of laughter. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the park in warm golden light. For the first time in weeks, Amelia let herself breathe. Jamal was alive. Marcus and Samantha had their father back. And though the system was still far from perfect, Amelia knew she had made a difference. Sometimes doing the right thing came at a cost, but the reward, the quiet, unshakable knowledge that she had saved a life was worth every sacrifice. As the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the trees, Amelia stood and walked toward the path that led home. Her steps were steady, her heart full. Change was slow, but it was possible, and Amelia Brooks, for all her exhaustion, was ready to keep fighting for it. Months later, the hospital felt different. Change had begun, not loudly, but in quiet, meaningful ways. Policies were being rewritten, patient advocacy programs were launched, and transparency became a word that no longer felt hollow. Amelia Brooks had been reinstated, not as a warning to others, but as a symbol of what was possible when one person stood up and refused to be silenced. Jamal Harris continued to recover, regaining his strength day by day. Amelia often saw him during checkups, always accompanied by Marcus and Samantha. The kids had started calling her Dr. A, their way of showing affection. "You're famous now, Dr. A," Marcus teased on one of their visits. "Mom says people talk about you all the time." "Good things, I hope," Amelia replied, smiling as she adjusted Jamal's chart. "All good," Jamal said, his voice steady and full of life. "You proved that one person can make a difference. Now others are stepping up too." Amelia nodded, a warmth spreading through her chest. It hadn't been easy, none of it was, but small ripples were turning into waves. As Jamal and his family left the hospital that day, Amelia stood at the window, watching them walk into the sunlight. Marcus darted ahead, his sister's laughter echoing through the air, and Jamal followed, strong and steady. Sometimes, doing the right thing changes more than one life. If this story touched you, it's because stories like Jamal's stories of resilience, courage, and hope exist in the real world. Amelia's fight was fictional, but it mirrors the quiet battles happening every day, where people stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Let's be a part of that change. Let's amplify voices that need to be heard, and let's remember that kindness, courage, and perseverance can create ripples far beyond what we see. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support allows stories of hope, empathy, and change to continue reaching those who need them most. Thank you for being here. And remember, one small act of kindness can change everything.